Good evening. Welcome to the People's Forum. How's everyone doing?
Great.
Good. Really nice to see you all here, and I'm truly thrilled to welcome you. My name is Jordan Camp. I'm the Director of Research here at the People's Forum, and I'm also a visiting scholar at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at the CUNY Graduate Center. And it's really a joy to host the launch of Sudhanva Deshpande's first book, Halla Bol, The Life and Times of Safdar Hashmi. And it's a really beautiful book that we're here to really celebrate as much as discuss. And I will give Sudhanva his proper introduction and our distinguished panelists. But if you just give me a moment, I want to draw your attention to a few events that are upcoming at the People's Forum, and then I'll introduce tonight's important discussion. I'll host a series throughout the spring. One of the first events I'll do is called Stirrings, How Activist New Yorkers Ignited a Movement for Food Justice. It's a new book out featuring Lana D. Povitz, and this is co-sponsored by the University of North Carolina Press. We hope that you will mark your calendars. I'm also delighted that we will host a discussion with Jody Dean about her new book, Comrade, out from Verso, and that's going to be on February 13th at 7 p.m., and that's co-sponsored by our friends at Verso Books. And then we have a talk by, I think the author is in the room tonight, by Christina Heatherton on February 29th, How to Make a Dress, Domestic Labor, Internationalism, and the Radical Pedagogy of Elizabeth Catlett, which is really significant for us here at the People's Forum, because how many people have been to our art studio in the basement, you know? It's called the Elizabeth Catlett Art Studio. But most don't know of her left internationalism, her pedagogy, and her radical vision, so Christina will introduce us to that on the 29th. I would be remiss not to mention a talk by Mary Louise Patterson about the book Letters from Langston. And those letters from Langston are to her parents, who are Harlem leftists. Our friend Gary Bono from International Publishers will know William Patterson, Louise Thompson Patterson. They were luminaries on the left. And this also shows that Langston continued his left vision when it had been kind of declined in many accounts. And last but not least, I want to announce that on May 14th, I'll host a talk on the common wind, and it is about the Afro-American currents in the Haitian Revolution. It's with the author Julius Scott and with the person who wrote the foreword, the historian Marcus Rediker. There'll be many other events, classes, discussions that you can find out about on our website, which I would really encourage you to check out. And so, last but not least, let me introduce tonight's event. As I said, we're thrilled to host a discussion of Sudhanva's book, Halla Bol. And Halla Bol, literally means raise hell. So we hope to raise some hell in our discussion this evening. It recounts the life of Safdar Hashmi, a founding member of Jan Natya Manch, which is otherwise known as People's Theater Front, or Janam, which will be discussed tonight. And I just want to say, amidst the violent repression that we see in India in this moment, there could really be no more timely discussion of the kind of socialist cultural activism that's celebrated, documented, and discussed in this book. So with that, allow me to introduce the speakers in the order in which they will talk tonight. Shiona Mitra, to my far left, is an assistant professor of theater at Barnard College. Her interest in political theater stems from her years as an actor with a Delhi-based street group, Jana Natya Manch. She is currently revising towards her publication or her manuscript, Contesting Capital, A History of Political Theater in Post-Colonial Delhi. Before Barnard, she's taught in many places, including Brown, New York University. She's taught at JNU and other campuses. No, you taught workshops there. You conducted lectures. Lectures there.
I'm really glad you added that.
Yes, sorry. when you said you conducted lectures on your description, I presume teaching. But, and among her current projects is a collaboration with a group of sex workers in India, examining the ways they've used theater for political mobilization. To my left, but to our speaker's right, is Amitava Kumar, who's a professor of English at Vassar College. He's the author of the novel Immigrant Montana, out from NOF, and I believe our friends at Word Up have copies of the book available, and Amitava has graciously agreed to sign the book after the event. He's written several works of literary nonfiction, including the prize-winning A Foreigner Carrying in the Crook of His Arm a Tiny Bomb. His other titles include Passport Photos, Bombay, London, New York, Husband of a Fanatic, A Matter of Rats, a short biography of Patna, and Lunch with a Bigot, The Writer in the World. Kumar's writings have appeared in Harper's, The Nation, The New York Times, TheNewYorker.com, Book Forum, among many others. Hi, Andy. And he has also published in Boston Review, The Indian Express. And last, but certainly not least, is Sudhanva Deshpande, who's a theater director, an actor, and the author of the book under discussion tonight. He joined Janam in 1987. He served in over 4,000 performances of over 80 plays. His articles have appeared in influential venues, including the Drama Review, The Hindu, The Frontline, Economic and Political Weekly, among many others. He's the editor of 2 volumes, The Theater of the Streets, The Jananatya March Experience, and co-editor of Our Stage, Pleasures and Perils of Theater Practice in India. And since 1998, he's been the managing editor of Leftward Books, the publisher of this beautiful volume. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Shona.
So Jordan instructed me to use the mic, which I directly took as an affront to my street theater training. But he tells me it's for the live stream. And just to start, there is an exchange in Halla Bol, the book, where Sudhanva, the author, meets Safdar, the hero of the book. And Safdar is really trying to get Sudhu to come to regular practices in Janam, and it sort of revolves around singing abilities. So this is the only time you will hear me say I am glad Safdar didn't meet me and didn't hear the sort of apocryphal levels to which singing has sometimes sunk in Janam when I was there. But I've had, it's really quite remarkable that I know Safdar only through his work and through people who know him. And this is the first book-length study of him. There's the only other book that exists, I think, which is closest to a biography, is written by his mother, Kamar Azad, and it's this wonderful book called The Fifth Flame. And that book is really, this personal history of the family. They were of modest means. They were left-leaning. She was a lifelong educator and a principal of a school for much of her life. But Halla Bol is something different, and I think something that's incredibly important. I don't know why it took 30 years to write, but I shouldn't talk about publishing deadlines. But it's an intellectual history of Safdar, right? And who he was. And sort of briefly to think about this, I don't know if Sudhu remembers this, but this was about 20 years ago. The first time I really saw a sustained study was this film called Safdar. It's a short documentary that Safdar Sehmat, which is the Safdar Hashmi Memorial Trust, brings out 3 months after he is killed. And I'm watching this documentary some 15 years after, and I remember this was at Jamia Millia Islamia University with other students. And this student was like, wow, I always knew the name Safdar. I knew there's a street in Delhi named after him, right? And if you've been to Delhi, there's Akbar Road and there's Joseph Tito Marg, and there are all of these very lofty names. And he's like, I always thought Safdar was this old guy. I didn't know he was this young, cool person, right? And that's the sense you get that we know the name. We know he's this incredible icon of the left and of progressive sort of movements. but we don't know much about sort of his life and the details and really the political history of how he becomes who he becomes. And so Halla Bol does this in this beautifully conversational, anecdotal way. It's part memoir. It's very difficult reading, particularly in the beginning bits, because we start with his death, right? We know that here's this 34-year-old man, he was attacked during a performance, and he dies of injuries sustained the next day. And you sort of read in extremely graphic, first-person narrative, for the first time, the details of what happened that day, right? And part of, I think, I don't know, maybe Sudhanva will share why he felt the need to write it, but for me reading it, I think it was that there's so many apocryphal accounts of Safdar's death. There's a mythology around it. And so there's a certain sort of need to return to basic details, right? What were the political forces? Who were these people? What was happening then? How does all of this unfold? And then sort of to think about, well, yes, this was an incident of extreme and maybe somewhat randomized violence, right? Part of the account is that Safdar wasn't necessarily targeted for being Safdar Hashmi, but he was someone who was prominent that day, and he obviously sort of was this person who took on leadership roles, et cetera, et cetera. So he stood out in the crowd. But then we really go into the other parts of the book. And this is what I think is crucial, is that when we think about Safdar, we think about someone who's a street theater artist, who's incredibly sort of theoretical and nuanced in the ways he's thinking about this new form, really, they were playing with. And they were discovering, and a lot of it was by chance, a lot of it was out of necessity. And so when he gets written about in theater, particularly after the fact, and there's several people who write about Janam and Safdar and go back to his writings, there are few contemporaneous interviews of him. I think what tends to get sort of emphasized is this role of street theater, right? What is this new genre? How did it develop? What are the plays? But as much, and this is really an important part of the book, we have to emphasize and we have to remember that at the time of the attack, Safdar was a full-time member and worker of the Communist Party of India, right? And Communist Party of India Marxist. So what is this political history? What were the kinds of organizational work he was doing? What was the kinds of trade unions and women's rights and really a host of sort of left progressive platforms that he was engaging with on, as a full-time worker of the party, right? So there's a lot of minutiae in the book, which I think is wonderful, of how do you organize, right? What does it mean for trade unions to call strikes? What does it mean for art that says it's progressive, it's leftist, it's socially conscious, all these words that we use sort of somewhat loosely? What is the work that goes behind that kind of organizing, right? It's not glamorous. It's extremely tedious. And it's, yes, there are these important moments that crystallize an artwork, but you really see the strength of the movements from which Safdar emerges and the kinds of plays that he makes, whether it's Machine, Aurat, or some of the others, including Halla Bol, actually. They emerge out of this history, this direct history and direct immersion in labor movements. And that's a sort of crucial part of the book. One of my favorite things, and this is, I encourage you to chat with Sudhanva after, and you will hopefully discover this. He's a chatter. So what you get in the book are these wonderful anecdotal accounts of people. So yes, it is a book called Halla Bol, The Death and Life of Safdar Hashmi, but for the first time, I think in reading certainly theater history and even Marxist history, there's such a weight on the cult of personality, right? The great men. And what this book does in this really wonderful, warm, conversational, anecdotal way is introduce a whole range of other characters who were just as involved. So who is, let's say, the CITU, which is the trade union center, the trade union secretary at the time that Safdar was working there? Who were the other people in the theater who started it with him? What kinds of backgrounds do they come from? A major part of the book, and really if you know anything about Janam, it is the role his partner, Maulaya Shri Hashmi, or Mala, plays, right? And Mala is someone who's not as, maybe now increasingly, but certainly contemporaneously with Safdar, she wasn't written about as much. She wasn't seen as a visible contributor to the kind of work Janam was producing. And what this book does is really in some ways center it around the two of them and see what a profound influence she has on, of course, Janam and the kinds of work that they were doing, but also on Safdar. And one of the, sort of the delightful things is he writes children's literature. He has this wonderful poem, if you've never read it, I encourage you to find it, called Kitabe, books, right? And it's about the magic of books. And a poem like that he writes because Mala is like, I need an aid to take, study aid to take to my students in Sardar Patel Vidyalaya, which is a school there, right? So there's a lot of kinds of writing that he's doing, a lot of genre experimentation he's doing that happens because of his collaboration and because of his deep, deep partnerships with so many people in his lives. So that's really kind of delightful to find that. There's a section on Habib Tanveer, again, this very, very prominent Indian theater director. But in this book, we hear as much about his wife, Monica Mishra, right? And we really see that in this moment where there's this sort of impasse in the creation of a play, and there's Safdar, there's Habib Saab, and there's Sudhanva, and they're really trying to figure out how to make this play work. It's really Monica Di who's sitting on the side and is like, you guys are idiots. This is what you need to be doing, right? And she really is able to figure out in a very pithy way what the problem was. And so I think it's sort of just wonderful to read that kind of account of work that you create collaboratively, that you create with other people, and that's centered around this one charismatic person, but really to show the sort of large movements and people that make up those movements. And then really briefly, I will say this. I've read this book a couple of times now. I got the copy just today. It's beautifully produced from what I can tell. But I have read and reviewed it. And even, I think it was really this summer, last summer, in sort of June of 2019, that Sudhu's like, oh, I'm finally writing my Safdar book. And I'm furiously interviewing people. And he presented this impossible timeline of interviewing, writing, translating, and then getting the book out by Jan 1st. And I'm like, yeah, Sudhu, sure, right? In 2 languages, yes. And he did. But while all of this is happening, if you've been semi-awake for the last 6 months, and really the last God knows how many years, the things have gotten progressively worse in India, right, and globally. And I think even in the readings of this book through the fall and now the winter, and it's really in the last week I've been thinking about it so much, right? Because there's this sense, we always feel like this historical moment that we're in is singular, that it's uniquely depressing, that it's very easy to feel defeatist, right? How do we even fight this? It's just so large, and all of these global forces coming together, and the left is fractured, the left is disorganized. What are we even doing with the arts? Like, does that make a difference? It's so easy to get into that kind of, sort of pessimistic and really hopeless mindset. And oddly enough, this book about death was one of the things that I kept returning to for hope, right? And it's really, that's why we read history, is really to see the sort of echoes and the layerings and the sort of repetition of events. And in Safdar's lifetime, he lives through some of the most climactic moments of Indian political history since independence, right? When he gets to this super elitist college, fairly young, at 16, in 1969, that's when Naxalbari, which is the peasant revolutions of Bengal, were happening. And there were really discussions within the student population of how do you participate, should you, et cetera, et cetera. And Safdar sort of finds his feet in that moment, and he's able to, it's hard to describe here because there is no organized left, but there's, there's not just a left presence within India, but there's several communist parties in India, right? There's the Communist Party of India, there's the Communist Party of Indian Marxists, there's a Communist Party of India Marxist-Leninist, and so there are all of these shades even within the left movement. And you see that sort of Safdar's coming of age is in this moment where you really have to think about what shade of red are you, right? How red is your red? And he's a student when all of this is happening. And then, sort of midway through, he's just starting out as a young professional. He's a professor, and that's, they're just starting to think about making theater, and they do a few plays. And you have emergency. And it's the only time, and many will argue that we are now living in undeclared emergency, but for what it's worth, the emergency was the only time that there was a declared suspension of civil rights in India, right? And there's Safdar living through it and really emerging from it with this new form of street theater. And then, of course, again, 1984, the anti-Sikh riots, right? And they were probably, to date, and hopefully not to repeat, the most violent riots Delhi has seen. And again, what is a cultural response to that? What is your responsibility as an artist to that? And then the book ends with, and this is truly the part of sort of excavating forgotten histories, I didn't know about this, I just heard about it, was there was a 7-day industrial strike in 1988 in Delhi. We haven't repeated that, right? 7-day strike. So again, the play, Halla Bol, is a direct response to that strike. So I'll end there, but really to think of history not, or the moment we live in, not as singular, as some ways that there are other times, and hopefully, and sort of magnificently, people making art through those difficult times. So, thank you.
All right. Shall I go on? Thank you. And Sudhanva, congratulations. We are missing tonight not only Safdar Hashmi, but another wonderful person, Vijay Prashad, who is in India at the moment. When Vijay asked me to blurb one of his book, I said he's our own Franz Fanon. And I'm mentioning that because I want to say Sudhanva Deshpande is our own Stuart Hall. Many years ago, I had interviewed a Bollywood actor and thought I would write about him. And then I went to Sudhanva and said, let's talk a little bit about, Bollywood and changes. And I don't know whether Sudhanva remembers. This must be 15, 20 years ago. But Sudhanva explained how earlier films in Bollywood would have the hero singing. Something like... Koi gaana batao, Udayanand wale? Ga ke suno. Please. Okay. The hero is singing some song. Mera dil, something. My heart is there for everyone. And Sudhanva explained how in the early films, first 2 decades, the hero would have to pass through, let's say, a tea garden, where there were laborers, and everyone would wave. Where, in other words, the words and the life of the protagonists of the films were related to the lives of the working class and the populace as such. ठीक है? And then that moment passed. And you had an entry into something much more individualistic, spectacular, etc., etc. All right. So I just want to note that, A, Vijay Prashad isn't here, our Franz Fenau, but our Stuart Hall is here, etc. Cool. Now Sudhanva. No, just to return to Shayoni's point about organization. Right now, while we are having this conversation, many women, including Muslim women, who have never stepped out of their homes necessarily, I heard them say this on TV yesterday, are doing their version of Occupy Wall Street, Occupy in Shaheen Park. And one woman said yesterday to this friend of mine who's a TV anchor there, Ravish Kumar, she said, we have never been encouraged to step outside our house, but we are doing that for the first time because our rights are important. We do not want anyone to protect us. We want our rights. That's all we need. And where it relates to Shani's point is, when these women are sitting for so many hours, for so many days, who is it who's bringing them tea? It's all about organization, What are the structures of organization that support activism and art? And one of the wonderful things, as Shani rightly pointed out about this book, is that in addition to documenting the life of one person, it actually illuminates the whole history of organized left struggle, particularly trade unions and working class struggles that have brought that art to the fore and allowed it to evolve in the powerful ways that it did. Cool? Jordan, how many minutes have I used of mine? Okay. Okay. I have very undistinguished connection to Safdar, but it is one of them that I feel impelled to mention is India and Pakistan were at war with each other when my wife, when the woman who became my wife said, you must meet my parents. They were Muslim, they were from Pakistan, I was from India. I am from India. I got on the bloody plane at LaGuardia, and the newspaper said, two Indian pilots shot at the Indo-Pak border. I thought this was not a good, we are still married, my wife and I, but it was not a good omen. And then I went, by the time I arrived at what became my in-laws, India and Pakistan were at war with each other. Anyway, they decided to go forward with the marriage, and then my mother-in-law, who's otherwise a very nice person, she was described in a Newsweek review of my book, Husband of a Fanatic, as manipulative in-laws. She didn't speak to me for a few months. She said, there'll be a little ceremony. Please choose a name. A name like Amitabh, a Muslim name, I mean, she said. Oh, how about Aftab? It sounds like Amitabh. What she was saying was that you have to convert. There was a little ceremony that was held. And I must say, I have no morals, but my own morality is only the search for a story. I thought, I must go on with this. See where it goes. You know what I'm saying? But the problem was, if I don't like the name Aftab, what name should I have? So I chose the name Safdar. I said, my name will be Safdar. And my main association with Safdar Hashmi is that I chose this name. And so whenever I give dry cleaning in a town like Karachi, I cannot use a Hindu name. The guy will say, Janam, aapka naam kya hai? What's your name? I'll say, Safdar Hashmi. Safdar Kumar. So that's my story. The other thing I want to read to you, even before that happened, even before there was marriage or romance in my life, was a little detail from a book I wrote 20 years ago called Bombay, London, New York, and Safdar Hashmi appears there. Yaar, kahan hai? All right. Talking about romance, by the way, I see Molly Crabapple in the audience, and I've had a long crush on her, so. Anyway. When I came to the United States, I laugh louder at my jokes than anyone else. I apologize. When I came to the United States, I thought I was going to go back to India after 2 years. Then I went to Minneapolis to join a doctoral program. 2 years became 5, and then the question never came up in the same way anymore. In Minneapolis, it used to be bitterly cold outside. I never got used to the snow. I was living in a small attic apartment. Through the sloping roof close above my head, I heard the scurrying of animal feet as I slept, and would come down at rigidly prescribed hours to cook my meals. My landlady, who allowed me the use of a kitchen, was a recently divorced woman in her 50s. She lived alone, playing the piano and drinking martinis at night, and I was struck by the fact that she never ate the green olives she put in her drink. This is a total third world thing. Why are you wasting those green olives? I'd never seen... Anyway, go on. Now, each morning, there were 2 or 3 plump olives lying discarded in the kitchen sink. On Saturdays, a Native American woman would come to clean the house. I cleaned my room myself, and I was permitted to do my laundry in the basement on weekdays. One evening, I descended from the attic to cook supper after my landlady had eaten, as was my custom, rice and progresso. This is the effect of being in People's Forum. You say progresso as progressive. Progresso lentil soup, disguised with a few basic spices to taste a bit like dal. When I sat down at the kitchen table, I saw that the landlady, I had not thought of her until I started writing this, but I believe her name was Meg, had left the day's New York Times for me, with a blue arrow pointing to an article. The headline read, "Street Dramatist in India Slain Over Play." The story began, I quote, "A leftist who was one of India's most popular street theatre directors was beaten to death by thugs last weekend." Now Molly is about to leave. This is how romance always ends in my life. I make an announcement which is entirely premature, and the person to whom it is addressed then says, "Bye." Okay, Molly, see you. A leftist who was one of India's most popular street theatre directors was beaten to death by thugs last weekend after he refused a politician's demand to stop a drama in support of an opposing candidate, witnesses said. Unquote. The slain theatre activist's name was Safdar Hashmi. I had watched his plays with great interest in India before I came to this country. In the 2 years prior to his death, I had written poems in which I hoped to emulate the didacticism and the wit that were the hallmark of Hashmi's plays. I sat looking at the Times photograph of his corpse. Around him, illuminated by the light of the Delhi morning, stood many progressive intellectuals whose faces I recognized. I do not think I had ever felt as alone as I did that evening in my landlady's kitchen. I will not claim that Safdar was a friend of mine, although I had exchanged greetings with him at the bus stop or at his street performances at Delhi University. He had an easy charm and a handsome face, and his talent was legendary. He was only 9 years older than I, and he had provided me a model for the writer I wanted to become in the future. Even in faraway Minneapolis, in the brief obituary, I caught a glimpse of what had made him so inspiring. I quote, "Mr. Hashmi was popular for brief, biting satires that made fun of corrupt politicians, policemen, and businessmen, which drew laughter and cheers from large audiences of industrial workers. His plays moved from the propagandist dramas of the 1970s to subtler themes." Safdar's killing unleashed a wave of grief and rage in India. The funeral procession was a 9-mile-long line of artists, workers, students, people from every fragment of a fragmented nation. This goes on, but I'm basically 2.5 pages, and Sudhanva was very disappointed with these 2 pages and thought he should write a book, which was a great idea. One paragraph I want to read is this. Safdar Hashmi received his mail in the offices of the Communist Party of India Marxist in Delhi. Most Indian writers in the West have addresses only in the creative writing programs of American universities. I think this line could be characterized as what I have learned from my children is called side-eye. Safdar thought of theatre as that which brings people closer to fighting organizations. Will the West's favorite Indian writers ever find institutions that can mobilize the South Asian community in the United States? Will the AFL-CIO come looking for the immigrant scribes to write about those who toil as cab drivers, nannies, nurses, garment workers, and non-contract laborers in cities like New York and San Francisco? When will Safdar Hashmi come to America? I think Safdar Hashmi has come to America with Halla Bol, the book by Sudhanva Deshpande, and I'm very happy about it.
Sudhanva.
All right. So first off, it's a real pleasure being here, and thank you, Jordan, and everyone at the People's Forum, and Shayoni, my old comrade and friend from Jannatimans. Sorry. Young, yes, my young comrade, and Amitawa, my old comrade from Delhi. And as has been mentioned already, but I do want to start with this. See, my relationship with Delhi is very complicated. I love the city and I hate the city. I can't stand living in the city and I can't stand being away from the city for too long. But every time I leave Delhi, I'm elated. I'm really happy to leave the city every single time, no matter where I'm going. It might be in India, it might be somewhere else, it might even be just to neighboring, whatever, Gurgaon or something, but I love going away from this city that I hate and I love. This was the first time in many, many years that I did not want to leave. And I did not want to leave because of what's happening in my city. It's incredible. It is just incredible. It's horrifying and it's inspiring at the same time. The campus that I've grown up on, the campus of the Jawaharlal Nehru University, which is the premier institution of higher learning, especially in the social sciences in India, is under an horrific attack. Horrific. It's mind-numbing. On the 5th of January, Sunday, I was on a train from Patna to Delhi, and we were getting these messages on WhatsApp and so on. And after about an hour or so, I turned off my phone because it was just so frustrating to sit in that train and to not be able to do anything and hear of what's happening on the campus, where a whole posse of right-wing goons had invaded the campus and was smashing students' heads and so on. But what was incredible is the next day there was a press conference, and the president of the Students' Union, a young woman called Aishi Ghosh, who's my comrade, she stood there with her head bandaged, and she ended her speech by saying, "We will not give an inch." It was incredible. We will not give an inch. And sorry. I'm sorry if I seem, a little bit emotional, but this is the spirit. And it's been amazing to me that my book was released on the 1st of January, which is the anniversary of the attack at Jhandapur, which is the site of the attack. And I've gone back to Jhandapur every year multiple times, but certainly on the 1st of Jan. And this was the 31st time that I was going back, the 31st year of the attack. And every year there are hundreds and thousands of workers who turn up there, and their families and children and so on and so forth. And just 4 days after that, on the 5th of Jan, this happens in JNU. And this has been preceded by all the other things that have been happening around this new citizenship law that's come in, which for the first time defines citizenship in terms of your religious affiliation, right? It's a stab of the knife to the heart of India. And I feel like this was the moment that this book was waiting for. Shiny said, why did it take 30 years to write this book? I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. Maybe the answer is that I was too close to it. Sometimes when things are too close to your eye, you can't see anything. It's out of focus. But something drove me to write this book this summer. And of course, I didn't know what was going to be happening in the winter when the book actually came out. That was impossible to say. But it was clear already in the summer, after the second election of Narendra Modi, that things were going to get much, much, much worse. And it's at a time like this that I felt like the story of Safdar Hashmi needs to be out there. And the story of Safdar Hashmi needs to be out there because, to my mind, amongst other things, of course, Safdar was my mentor, he was my comrade, he was my friend. He was a superb artist, superb. He is a very talented writer. And he could write on virtually anything. And he could write on command. Not for him this whole idea of, when inspiration strikes, I will write. No. You told Safdar, I want something on this now, in the next 2 hours, in the next 2 days. And he would write. And he would work very hard on his writing, and he took his writing very seriously. So he thought very hard about form and, the words that he would use and the cadence of what he was doing and so on. But he wrote on command. And why did he write on command? Exactly because of the reasons that both Shayani and Amitava have spoken about, because he was part of a movement. He was a communist, and he took that very seriously. 1 week before he was killed, what was he doing? Every day he was at the international airport in Delhi, basically coordinating the visits of the foreign delegations that had come for the CPIM party congress, right? So that's what he was doing there. This is work that would always remain invisible. Yeah, it's work that nobody sees. It's not work that is, sort of seen as being heroic or anything. It's tedious work. It's also work that requires a lot of detailed attention to really tiny things. Yeah, and that's the work that he was doing literally 1 week before he was killed. That was his life. And I've been witness, I didn't know Safdar for a very long time. I knew him as a friend for a few years before I came into Janam in the summer of '87. So I actually worked with Safdar in an intense way, only for about 6 months. But I knew him for much longer. And he had kind of strangely become my friend in a manner of speaking. Although he was about 14 years older than me, and when you're 19, then 14 years actually matters, right? When you're 40 or something, it doesn't matter so much, right? But when you're 18, 19, 17, etc., at that time, that age difference is a huge difference. But he became my friend, and he was always lovely to talk to. You could chat with him, you could pull his leg, you could argue with him, and one never felt that you were being talked down to. You always felt like he wanted to hear what you had to say. He was interested in your opinions. He was interested in what you were observing. He was interested in what you were reading, what you were watching, and so on and so forth. So I actually worked with Safdar for a very brief time, in an intense way, for about 6 months. And one of the reasons why this book did not get written for so many years, apart from the fact that maybe I was too close to it, but was also the fact that I couldn't find a narrative arc for this book. For a long time, I kept doing interviews with people. I've done interviews with people over 25 years now. Some of those interviews I've lost. I don't anymore have access to them and so on. But whatever, I have memories. And there are other conversations that I've done which have not been interviews, but which, through life one just chats about things and so on. But 2 years ago, I remember I started to make a framework for the book. And it just didn't work. because what I was trying to do was to write a biography of Safdar Hashmi. And then at some point this summer, I just realized I cannot write a biography. I have to write a story. And in this story, it's a narrative arc. I have to think of it like a play. I have to think of it like a movie, maybe, you know. I have to think of it like a novel. And so it was inevitable that it started with the death of Safdar. It is inevitable for a whole range of reasons. One of it is an emotional reason, because Safdar's death is something that still rankles. It's something that still hurts. So I needed to get it out of the way. As a writer, it was essential for me. At that time, I didn't know that the book was going to start with that. But my writing process started with what happened in the attack and so on. So I had to get that out of the way before I could reach the other parts. But one was that. But the other thing was also, as Shaini said, Safdar has acquired something of a iconic status. And for a lot of young people, especially in activism and theater and so on, they have a hazy idea of what Safdar Hashmi, who Safdar Hashmi was, right? And they know, there was this guy who was killed for doing a play, right? And I felt like if that's the reason why he's known to so many young people, then let me start with that. Let me start with the death and then go on to the life. So the book moves in 3 parts. The first part is the attack, what happened, and immediately afterwards what happened. So on the 1st of January, the attack happened. 2nd of January, Safdar dies in hospital. 3rd is the funeral procession, which Amitabha speaks about. And on the 4th of January, we went back and performed the same play under Mala's leadership at Jhandapur. So less than 48 hours after Safdar was killed, we were back there and we performed the play. And it became, at that time I was not aware of it. I mean, I was in a state of shock. Literally, I just didn't know what was happening. I was not able to cry. I was not able to, sense anything really. But subsequently, I feel like that was that in the history of Indian street theatre, it was probably the single most iconic moment of Mala going back and us performing there, and the more I thought about it, it made sense to me that moment stood for something that went far beyond the act of one person or one group going back and performing. It encapsulated a whole range of things, and it brought together many strands of Indian history. So I felt like I needed to investigate what that moment was. One of the questions that we are asked very often is, why did this attack happen? Why was Safdar killed? And it's always awfully hard to answer that question, because it's not like, as Shaini said, it's not like Safdar was killed because they knew who Safdar Hashmi was. But it's also true that Safdar was killed because he was Safdar. Meaning that because he was Safdar, he put himself, his own body, between the attackers and the rest of us. So it was logical that he had to be removed. What he ensured is that the rest of us were safe. Right? But it's not like the attackers knew what they had done, in the sense that they didn't know that this was an artist and they didn't know his name and so on. But the reason why he was killed in that sense is not because he was Safdar Hashmi. The reason he was killed is because this class struggle. Why were we there? Why were we performing there on that day? We were performing because we were part of, and we still are a part of, the workers' movement, the labor movement, the trade union movement. That's what we were part of. That's the reason why we were there. That's the reason, that's what they wanted to crush. It was the labor movement. And attacking a play is a very simple thing to do. Because, artists are vulnerable. We don't go there with arms and so on, right? We don't know how to fight. Yeah? It's easy to attack artists, especially in that kind of a setting. It's open, you're strangers there in a sense. You don't know the layout of the lay of the land. You don't know all the gullies and so on. You don't know where to escape, etc., etc. It's really easy to attack us. So therefore, the attack on Jannati Manch was not an attack only on Jannati Manch. It is not an accident that the other person who was killed that day was a worker, a man called Ram Bahadur, who was a migrant worker from Nepal, a young father, and he was randomly killed. They just went to his house, they pulled him out, and just shot him dead. Literally, just like that. Why? Because they wanted to create terror. And terror for whom? For workers. And why? How dare these workers organize themselves? How dare they ask for rights? How dare they? Yeah? So the attack on Jannati Manch and the killing of Safdar was not targeted assassination in that sense, but it was part of the class struggle. And that's the story I wanted to tell. So then it became important for me. Of course, I've been part of this for a very long time. I've done street theater now for 30 odd years. I've done hundreds of performances at trade union venues, in industrial areas, and so on. Thousands of performances, actually. And so I know a large number of trade union organizers quite well. And not just trade union organizers. I know a large number of women's movement organizers, student organizers, and so on, quite well. And I've known them for years. And it seems to me that it seemed to me that I needed to tell the story of why is it that these people come to us and say, "Comrade, we want your play"? Why do they want it? And I wanted to ask this question, even though it might appear to be the most obvious thing in the world, right? But I think that it's useful to ask this question. It's instructive to ask this question. What does culture do? What does art do in movements? And when does art and culture and so on start to speak for the people? How does it capture the imagination of people engaged in struggles? So I needed to tell this story, and so therefore a large part of the third part of the book is about the strike that happened in 1988, the 7-day strike. What were the issues of the strike? What were the difficulties in organizing workers? And so on and so forth. Entire pages have been spent in detailing that to a great extent, and the reason why I do that is because unless you understand that, you don't understand what the play Halla Bol did. Why was the play so successful? And it was successful, I know this, I acted in the play. When the play was being made, I was intimately a part of it. 2 very crucial scenes in the play were written by me. So I knew exactly how we made that play. And then when the play got made and we started performing it, it was electrifying. And I'm saying this with no sense of nostalgia. I've been doing this for a very long time, and literally in the last 30 odd years, I can't think of any other instance, literally no other instance, where a play captured the imagination of the people it was meant for in quite that way. Now,
we should read that part first.
Of
One of the electrifying scenes that are part of this one.
yeah. So, And so what I also wanted to do was to include the play at the end of the book to give a flavor of what the play was trying to do, the entire text of the play. Of course, here it's translated into English, but I feel like, and this to me was the greatness of the artist that Safdar was. There's a way in which Safdar was able to write things very simply and to articulate things very simply, without diluting the complexity of the situation. Right? So not simplify it. So the entire complexity of a debate, of a situation, of a context would seep into the play, and the expression of it would be very simple. So if you read the play, you'll find that it's actually a very simple play to understand. There's no complexity in that sense, but it works like magic. It worked like magic with workers because they saw their lives being reflected there. How did that happen? How could it happen? It happened because it was Safdar more than anyone else. And I say this with full confidence because I was part of that process. I had no idea at that time, in 1988 when the play was made, I had no idea, I had virtually almost no experience of being involved in any kind of trade union work or struggle, etc., etc. I didn't know how workers lived, and it was true for most of us at that time. We were all very young, we were all very raw. We had come there because we loved theater and so on. We were not there for, politics and stuff like that. We were there to have a good time, right? It was Safdar more than anyone else who caught that moment and converted it and transferred it to us in some way, and that gets reflected in the play itself. And so therefore the structure of the book is really, there are three parts, as I said. The first part is about the killing itself and immediately after the killing. In the second part we go back to the beginning, his childhood, his growing up years, etc. All the various people who were part of his life and who influenced his life and who together made up this movement. I wish I had the space, and I wish I had the skill to be able to bring in even more people. There are like a million other people I can think of who haven't made it into the book. Friends and comrades of Safdar and people that I've grown up admiring. But I tried to do what I could, and this is really it's emblematic in a sense, that by giving a little glimpse you hope that you'll be able to suggest more. So that's what I tried to do in the book. And in the third part of the book we come to these final 6 months of his life, because those are also crucial. It happens at a time when it felt like to me at that time that Janam was about to die, and Safdar somehow pulled it up by the organization by the scruff of its neck and revived it. And he did something quite remarkable. In those 6 months he got a whole lot of young people like myself involved in the organization. He gave us creative challenges. He got a whole lot of other people like Habib Tanveer and so on to come and work with us. He gave us a dream, and it's so as Shiny said, this book is not just about Safdar. Of course he's the hero of this story, there's no question about it, but the book is equally about a whole lot of other comrades who are part of this life and the struggle. And in one sense, this book is a love letter. It's a love letter. It's a love letter to Safdar and to the movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have time for a few questions before we...
No, man, they're going to do a dramatic reading.
Oh, he's going to do a reading.
No.
If you wanted to read it...
No, that's fine. That's
Okay,
fine.
sure.
I was just looking at something.
Sure, we would love
No,
to.
no.
One comes to a discussion of
They're gonna
street theater,
search.
there's no theater. Yeah. Paisa vasool nahi hua.
Arey yaar.
I think the people may demand it.
Okay.
Yes, little
Right?
bit.
Wasn't this the whole given to the people's demand? Listen
Just
to
little
them.
bit.
True.
It's a
Can we
people's
hear it?
People want to hear.
Who wants to hear a reading
I'll-
from Sudhanva? I don't think you're loud enough. Okay, Sudhanva, I can do nothing for you. man.
All right. I'll just read a little bit of the beginning of the play Halla Bol. So maybe a page and a half, right? Of the beginning of the play. All right. So the actors are in a circle. One actor enters and starts with slogans. The other actors join him in a procession. They hold red flags and shout slogans.
What are the slogans?
And the slogans are workers stand up for your rights, comrades stand up to resist, and so on. And there's a song against oppression and exploitation. We raise our might. Hear our clarion call. We should not cease to fight. How long will you oppress us? How many imprison in your jails? We shall fight. We shall resist. We shall surely prevail. So one actor gets up and blocks their way. He wears a police cap and holds a baton.
And Safdar used to perform that role.
No. Safdar didn't really act in the play except when he had to replace somebody. So the policeman, stop, I say. Hey, didn't you hear me? What did I tell you? Hey, you bloody Mr. Revolutionary, shut your gob. You won't listen so easily. Patak! You scoundrel, what are you up to? We are just doing a play, sir. Play? You think I'm a fucking idiot? No, sir. So what? Arey, is this a way to do a play? Shouting slogans, raising red flags, holding posters. Get lost this minute, you bastards, or I'll put all of you in jail. Arey, sir, please believe us. Constable, sir, we are only doing a play. You see, you can ask all these people. We are all artists, actors of Jannatyamans. Yes, Jannatyamans of international fame. Oh, I see. So you were doing a play. Yes, sir. All right, go ahead. But do a really good play, huh? Yeah. Yes, sir. So if you could just move aside a bit, we shall start now. All right, come on, everybody. Long live the revolution. CITU, long live. Hey, what is this? Do your play. The play, I said. No slogan shouting. But, sir, our play calls for this action. What? Your play calls for slogans. But slogans are not allowed in this area. We have strict orders ever since the 7-day strike took place. It's an order from the SHO Sahib. Arrest anyone who even mentions CITU immediately without asking for any explanation. But sir, we have to raise slogans in our play. Yes, Constable Sahib, slogans are absolutely essential to our play. No, not in my area. Then what? So then, how do we do our play? You bastard! Do I have to explain how? Do a normal play with a love angle, with the lover quoting his beloved, some song and dance, some jokes, some comedy, some this, some that. Huh? Understand? Yes. Understood. What? So, sir, you want to play about lovers, no? Yes. And no slogans? Yes. No slogans. All right, sir. All right. As you order. We'll show you a play about lovers. So, friends, Constable Sahib does not allow us to do a revolutionary play. So, we will show you a play about love. And that's how the play begins.
So we have time for a few questions. Yeah. Now we'll ask you to speak into the mic so that we can record. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, in the protest movement in India right now, we've been seeing a lot of creative and inventive protests. And unfortunately, in fact, fortunately, theater has been deeply at the forefront the way people have been using poems or street theater at JNU Jamia. I just want to know, how does Halla Bol translate today? And I know it's not a simple answer, but if you could explain in a few words.
I think the spirit of Halla Bol translates. The play itself is a very specific play. It's a play about a particular strike at a particular moment in Delhi's history, at a particular moment in the working class struggle in Delhi, etc. So that play itself is something that we haven't done for years and years now, you know. But the spirit of Halla Bol, that's what you're seeing on the streets today. And what's incredible is the new voices that are coming up. Just yesterday, in fact, Shiny and I were exchanging notes about all the fantastic poetry that's coming out of this moment. Amazing poetry. Jamia ki ladkiyan, Hindustani Musalman, and so on and so forth, you know. There's this absolutely incredible rap song called Tukde Tukde Gang. Right? Incredible. I mean, it's just fantastic. And young people, unknown artists, nobody knew them till now. And each of these videos now has 500,000 hits and so on, you know. And they're going viral on WhatsApp and stuff. Plus, there's also other kinds of protests. So, like Maya Rao did one with a sari, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a whole ton of them, right? But I think it's an incredible moment. It's an incredible moment. Or just, I mean, for those of you who are familiar with India and, you know, in the last few years, even if you just look at how, for instance, Kanhaiya does the Azadi slogan, you know, it's nothing less than a rap, like it's a rock show, yeah? And he can get the whole audience riled up, and he's wonderful how he does it. There's such a great performative energy to what he does. And in fact, it's interesting, when he was asked at one point, you know, how do you do this? I mean, we all raise slogans, right? And some of the slogans are energizing and so on, but they're not, you know, they don't have this lyricism that he's able to bring into it. So somebody asked him, you know, where do you get this from? He said, from the IPTA, IPTA. Right? Because that's what he's grown up watching. So yes, the spirit of Halla Bol is very much there on the streets of Delhi and in the rest of the country. Oh yes, the slogan Halla Bol is also. I mean, the slogan Halla Bol predates the play. So this is not the play takes something that was already there in the public imagination. Yes, please.
Hi. I'm wondering if you can talk about the relationship between art and revolution or movements or organizing a little bit, whether art is just a tool, whether it's necessary, sort of how you see that.
Yeah, that's an awfully complicated question. And there's no one single answer to it. I think just as art is not one thing, you know, there are different kinds of art and there are different levels at which it works. And so therefore its connection to social change or revolutionary change or say political movements is also not one thing. Right? There's a way in which, for instance, in Jannatimans, we have worked very closely with trade unions, with women's organizations, with student groups, and so on and so forth. But that's not the only way it works. For us, it's really important also because it's the form of street theater. You know, unlike, let's say, a poem, a play can only exist in the moment of its performance, right? And it can only exist in front of a live audience who shares that space and that moment with you. Now, Where do you get this live audience from? What happens before you go there, and what happens after you leave from there? All of these are questions which the theater piece and the theater actors cannot answer. There's got to be something else that happens before and after. And even while you're performing, something else has to happen. Who's going to bring that in? And so we feel that it's really important for us to work with organizations, and that's what we've done all these years. Paulo Freire famously said, education doesn't change the world. It changes people, and people change the world, right? You could say the same about art. Art doesn't change the world, but art allows us to imagine a different world. And I think what it does in terms of how it helps us to imagine something different is already a first step towards being able to make that change. Please, of course.
Also, yes, art as coming out of movements, but sometimes, and I think this moment is a wonderful example of this. I don't know if you know the poem, it's new, Hum kagaz nahi dikhayenge. We will not show our papers, right? And this is Varun Grover writes it, and he performs it. And this is the interesting thing. The moment of poetry right now is public. We're seeing people at these protests performing their poetry. They're not writing it and publishing it and circulating it, but it really comes into its own as performance. And I think sometimes the kagas nahi dikhayenge, we will not show papers, obviously is taking a huge historical sort of moment. It has resonances in other time periods and places, but it gives us an action, it gives us a very pithy sense of what a resistive gesture should look like. And I think that's when this kind of magic happens, right? That the art is capturing something that's there, but it's also giving back to the moment, something that you can really use. There's this other, and we were talking a lot about the poems coming out, Jamia Ki Ladkiyan, the girls of Jamia, who Amitav was saying are now occupying Shaheen Bagh. And there's this lovely hum cigarette bhi peete hain. Here are these Muslim women, we smoke cigarettes, we are out on the streets, and we are also protesting, right? And so it's really, the other one was, and I could truly go on, but tum kaun ho be? Who the fuck are you, right? It's this really, really lovely poem where he describes patriotism as a sasta nasha, as a cheap intoxication, right? And I really thought about it, it's like, wow, just that one little sentence does so much more than so many academic papers I read, right? So there's something like, it's really lovely, the sort of what the word and gesture brings in the moment of performance that other forms, other ways of addressing might not be able to do. So.
Thank you. We have time for one more question or even comment from the panel, including Amitava.
I just wanted to know, why did she leave so early? I'm just joking. Idiot.
Thank you. Hi. So I'm about halfway through the book, which it's incredible. And one of the things that I'm struck by as a theater maker and practitioner, like you reference so many wonderful plays, and you kind of talk about what they're about and things like that. In my own history, kind of with somewhat similar movements when we were trying to do the research on, particularly in the early days of that work, was, because it was part of a workers' movement and because of a variety of reasons, our ability to document those plays and what they were was very thin. Like, we don't have a lot. We know, for example, there were thousands of these short scripts, but we don't have any of them anymore. And I was just curious what level of documentation was possible or was done, particularly in the early days, and now referencing a lot of those plays. And I think that was that's my question.
Well, it's very patchy. There's some things for which we have fairly good documentation. There's some things for which we have no documentation. So some of the very early work that, for instance, we did, Janam did, there's almost no documentation of that. A friend and comrade of mine, Komita, she's been trying to look at work in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. It's very hard to get sources and papers and documents and so on. There are some old timers who are still there. You can interview them, but like memory is memory after all. It's it varies a lot and so on. So overall, I would say for the movement as a whole, not just about Janam, but for the movement as a whole, the documentation is woefully inadequate. And so, which is why you have to clutch at whatever you can get. And a large part of this book would not be possible without interviews. And interviews with all their problems, in the sense of, people remember some things, they don't remember some things, some people remember the same things differently and so on. But that's what you've got to work with, because there's very little, I think Janam has been lucky in the sense, for two reasons. One is because Safdar himself, right from the first moment of street theatre, in 1978 when Janam did its very first street play, Machine, 4 months later he writes a note which is meant for internal circulation within Comrades. And he talks about this new form of street theatre that they're experimenting with and what their experiences are, right? So he's very conscious of the fact that they've hit upon something quite exciting and quite new, and he's trying to theorize it or trying to understand it from that moment on. And so his own papers are quite rich. And we are also very lucky that there's somebody like Mala Maloishri who is the de facto archivist of Janam, and she's made sure that all of that has survived and so on. But for the movement as a whole, the paper documentation is very, very thin. If you go back even further, if you go back to the time of the IPTA in the 1940s and so on, we know of some plays, we know names of some plays, like Charge Sheet, for instance, which is a play from the 1940s, from the late 1940s. Now, we just know that it's about, after independence, it's arguing for release of political prisoners who were involved in the anti-colonial struggle, right, who were still in prison after India became independent. Now, that's all we know about the play. We don't have a single photograph, we don't have a single script, we don't know anything about it. Literally nothing else. The IPTA is the Indian People's Theatre Association. This was an outcome of the Progressive Writers Association, which was formed in 1936. IPTA itself comes into being in the early 1940s. There's no precise one date, but generally 1942, 43 is what is considered as the foundational movement of the IPTA. And between the Progressive Writers Association and the Indian People's Theatre Association, you had a galaxy of creative people, artists in all genres, all art forms, who were part of these two very large movements. And they were anti-colonial and anti-fascist movements, both at the same time. They were also led to a great extent by the Communist Party. At that time, the CPI, and the General Secretary of the Communist Party, P.C. Joshi at that time, was a very enlightened person who was deeply committed to art and culture. And if you read accounts of that time, then all these major artists are deeply appreciative of the role that he plays in particular. And so that also brings into focus the importance of having enlightened political activists who understand the role of culture beyond just an instrumentalist use of culture, and so on. So sadly, for the movement as a whole, the documentation is not great, but now there's a lot of work happening. So there are, younger researchers who are trying to recover whatever exists. I don't even know. There might be some private papers somewhere, somebody's family papers, etc., that might still, I'm sure they'll come to light.
Well, I am sure that there's many more questions in the room, but I want to save time for you to buy a book from Word Up.
And I should say also, sorry
Yes.
to interrupt, but I should say that this book is not going to be available in bookshops. in the US, right? So this is your chance.
Yes. I was just going to say, and you can get a copy of Sudhanva's, you can get a copy of Amitabha's. I can't say enough how beautiful this book is. You know, the critical theorist Ejaz Ahmad says it reads itself like a play. You know, it's truly gorgeous prose. So I give it my highest recommendation. And please do buy a copy so we can continue to do these kinds of events. Then from the People's Forum, I want to give this to you, Sudhanva, and
thank you.
congratulate you on this beautiful book. It will
Thank you.
always make my colleagues and I proud that we launched this book. So please
Thank
join
you.
me in giving
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And when you buy the book, come get a signature. Okay? Thanks, friends.
Thank you. Thank you, Jordan.
Yes. This is a T-shirt. I hope it's your size.
Yes, yes. I'm sure. I'm an actor. I'm an actor. I fit into anything. Acha, tum bhag to nahi rahe?
Can you sign my book?
Of course. Of course. Of course.
Sign my book.
Of course. Do we write